Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this Hunt Scanlon Media sponsored webinar on executive leaders and the business decisions they make. I'm really excited to get into it. My name's Aaron Mitchell Finegold. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Kingsley Gate. Just to walk through the flow of the hour we have together, I will start by introducing our esteemed panel. I will then move into asking them some prepared questions that I have, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you, which our panelists will take turns answering. Just a note on intros, these are purposefully truncated, so I imagine that you probably want to hear their insights directly from them versus me talking endlessly about their various accomplishments, which I could easily do. So just know that each person here has achieved way more than will be covered orally when we do their bios. And then a note on housekeeping for the audience Q&A. If you would please be so kind as to put your questions in the Zoom Q&A function box versus the general chat, that would be greatly appreciated. And it will help ensure that your question actually gets the airtime it deserves. Okay, now to introduce our panel. This is in alphabetical order, just in case you were wondering, that seemed fairest to me. Kristina Kalkman is a partner at Kingsley Gate. She has a track record of success across many industries, including technology, consumer, energy, insurance, and industrial manufacturing. As a former entrepreneur, Kristina understands firsthand her clients' drive to advance revenue, profitability, and growth. She's found particular traction working with founders and CEOs of privately held companies, helping them define and hire the right leadership for whatever the next stage in that company's life cycle may be. Kristina has been in the Pacific Northwest for the past 20 years, and despite having deep experience across the entire United States, she does bring unique insight to any work that's connected to that market. She enjoys fly fishing, golfing, and what I labeled Epicurean exploration. Gary Pinkus is the chairman of McKinsey and Company North America and has previously held illustrious roles like managing partner, McKinsey North America, head of McKinsey's Western United States, member of the Shareholders Council, and global private equity and principal investors practice leader, which he helped co-found more than 2 decades ago. His global career started at McKinsey in LA in 1987, after which he's worked in Honduras, New York, Houston, Mexico City, Zurich, and Sydney. Lately, Gary and his family have been splitting time between home bases in San Francisco and London, the latter being where he is driving a renewed focus on private equity and principal investors at McKinsey. He and his wife have 4 children and 3 dogs. Kristina Sobhani is a senior partner at Kingsley Gate. She brings over 20 years of cross-industry recruiting experience to the firm. She previously has held roles such as partner at August Leadership, managing director at Allegis Partners, VP of Global Client Solutions at Korn Ferry, and financial services practice director at Pontoon Solutions, where she oversaw a team of over 80 and managed a multi-million-dollar budget. She's also held roles at BNP Paribas, Michael Page International, Creditland.com, and Madsen Staffing Services. She's based in New York, is fluent in Farsi, and is an enthusiastic world traveler. Well, welcome to all 3 of you. We're so happy to have you. Let's get into the content. I wanted to start with some principles and some grounding in the facts. McKinsey's published a lot on this topic of decision-making, including an assertion that senior executives spend about 40% of their time on decision-making. To me, reading that was a bit astounding. I highly doubt that there's any other cognitive mode, so to speak, that takes up greater mind share or has greater consequences for business performance. Given this staggering figure, it was also, for us at Kingsley Gate, really noticeably absent, to be honest, from the executive search industry discourse, which is why we've put so much energy and investment behind helping ourselves and helping our clients to better understand it. So the first question, which I will pose to Gary Pinkus first, is, in my mind, McKinsey's client impact is realized through decisions, essentially. So naturally, you all are quite expert on how these decisions materialize and whether or not that happens in an effective or an ineffective way. I think there are two stats that really say it all. The first one is 61% of leaders say that at least half the time spent at their companies on decision-making is ineffective. The other stat is that the average Fortune 500 company wastes about 500,000 days per year on ineffective decision-making. This is mirrored by Kingsley Gate's own research, where we found that 63% of senior executives have either resigned or considered resigning from a job due specifically to frustration with how decisions are being made. So the question that I want to pose to you, Gary, is essentially in three parts. A, what is happening? So what are these companies getting wrong? How is this much time being wasted? B, are there some companies out there that are making great decisions through highly suboptimal processes? Because I think we can disaggregate this idea of the actual decision arrived at versus the process used to get there. And if that is the case, does that matter? What would the implications be? And then C, in this three-part question, is there a holy grail? Can we ever get it right? Right now, it seems like the data suggests that a lot of time is being wasted. If we were to swing the pendulum, we could end up seeing companies maybe making decisions too quickly or in too rushed a fashion where all the right inputs aren't taken into consideration. What does good look like here, and will we ever get there?
So, Aaron, at the risk of the obvious, there's a lot in your question. I'll try to unpack it along the lines of what you suggested. And it may be in some ways part of the answer to that third question on the Holy Grail is answered a little bit in the first part of the question, which you refer to the McKinsey research. And a very important point of that research is that the authors did not say that bad decisions were being made. They said the processes themselves were ineffective. There was a lot of wasted time in the process. The reason why, in a sense, there's no holy grail here is it's all, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so for any process where you need to get to a good, thoughtful outcome, there will be some set of people that will disagree that and on both sides, that the process was too intrusive, too complex, too consensus driven, and others will say that it was not fast enough, it was not thoughtful enough, the right people were not involved. And oftentimes on that, not surprisingly, where you stand on the process is where you sit in the organization. And so if you feel like you should have been involved and weren't, you will say the process was not thoughtful enough. And if you feel like you were involved and it took twice as much time as it should have, you would say the process had way too many people involved in way too many parts of it. And so almost by definition, there's not a holy grail in terms of perception. There may be some sort of holy grail in terms of thoughtful, well-executed processes that get to good outcomes. And that takes me a little to your second question. There are definitely processes that use a lot of extra time and maybe even perceived by everybody to use too much time, but actually do get to a thoughtful, a well-researched and as good an outcome as you can get, recognizing sometimes the world doesn't operate the way you hoped and expected that it would. And so this is not about perfection. It's about getting to the best outcome armed with the best information you have at the moment. The places, and I'll then pause for breath, but the places where I've seen companies get this messed up, where they actually have good processes, but somehow they may or may not get to a good outcome, and they certainly spend too much time on it, or where they don't fit the process to the purpose. And so I've got one client that's in the process of work trying to help them fix this, where they have massive capital expenditures, multi-year capital expenditures executed in multiple phases. They have a very complex process for approvals and then ongoing approvals of that CapEx. It's well designed, it's thoughtful, it brings the right groups and organizations in. It mostly works. They then use that exact same process for maintenance operations that they would do, or maintenance capital X that they would do in the quarter. That could be a fraction of the cost of these larger projects. That is way too complex, but they say that's how we do our CapEx processes. And what they haven't done is design more fit the purpose, because they say this is the way we do it. Anytime you hear a company say this is the X way, a little warning bell should go off. That's almost always a good idea for a period of time, and then eventually it gets taken to sort of the ad absurdum of, well, that's the only way we do things. And that can't be true forever. Let me pause there.
Great, thank you. Christine, thoughts?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Gary was saying, I agree with all of it. I think one other thing I would add is I think companies typically also get it right, or more right, let's say, when they have a really clear understanding of what their objectives and goals are, right? And so I think when the team knows this is what our final objective and goal is, the decision-making process just naturally is a little bit easier. I think when there's differing opinions on what their objectives and their goals are, naturally the process is really amplified and it's harder to reach decisions that everyone can support.
Yeah, I'll kind of piggyback on both of them with, I think some of the key things are really having established decision rights and rules so that you know where you sit in terms of making that decision and what your part is. And also prioritizing the criteria so that you are not spending all your time really focused on some low priorities and debating that, but having a clear understanding of that, the priority of that criteria that you have.
I think that these are great, rich, insightful answers. One of the other thoughts that's inspired by what you all have said is, I think, Gary, going back to your point about there will be complaints kind of on either side of this equilibrium. I do also believe that there is some use in just having a thoughtful communication with input providers to let them know when the decision maker is going to come to you for input, what type of input that person is seeking, and how it will be used, which is to say that the ultimate decision made might actually not be congruent with what you think is best, but your input is one in a set of many, and it's being taken seriously. It's being thought through rigorously, but it needs to be calibrated against all of these other considerations. And so I think sometimes expectations are either mismanaged or inflated or whatnot, where input providers feel that if the ultimate decision doesn't match what they wanted, their input was a waste of time. Whereas actually, no, it was very helpful in informing the ultimate decision. The direction just ended up being different, and probably for good reason.
Aaron, I think that's a really important point. And it actually tees up one other topic, which is there are some decisions that get made within an organization where the critical thing is to get the decision right. And the actual execution is not, I mean, execution is always important, but it's actually the right decision, and then the execution will naturally follow. There's others where actually the decision itself is not the critical thing. The decision is to have everyone buy into the decision. And that one of 4 or 5 different answers would actually be perfectly fine as long as everybody executes appropriately against the answer. And you need different levels of consensus, obviously, between those 2 bookends I just painted.
Yeah, such a great point. And it's a great segue into my next question. There is, as you pointed out, Gary, at any organization, a kind of diversity of different decisions that need to be made, along with, as you said, the kind of the stakes attached to them. There also are naturally, I think, going to be a diversity of inherent decision-making approaches among leaders at companies. And so while I think, a lot of the research on diversity has shown us over the years, including McKinsey's own research, demographic diversity is extremely beneficial when it comes to financial performance for companies. Diversity of experience, background, perspective, that's all really helpful. But there is also we can name it, there's some forms of diversity that wouldn't be helpful on a team. For example, if everybody on the team has a really different understanding of what the objective is, to your point, Kristina, about clarity there, or if everybody had a really different understanding of the problem statement or the timeline for making decision, that wouldn't be helpful. And so the question, Kristina, that I want to ask you is essentially, how do you think about assembling a team to work on decision making where every member maybe brings their own instinctive style or approach to decision making? Is that beneficial? Is that not? What care needs to be taken when a situation like that might be the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I think there's so many pros to having a good diverse group that brings different experience and knowledge to any decision-making process. Of course, you need to make sure you have the right environment of inclusion and respect, and that's going to be key to that. As you mentioned, you can look at this from different angles. There's different decision-making styles and approaches. There's also groups that have the same style, but they may have differing opinions. I think all of these are beneficial. I think is what you want to watch out for is when your entire group has the same style and approach and similar type opinions. And I think when you have that, you really lose out on the benefits of having a diverse group, such as innovation, thinking outside the box, balanced risk assessment, really seeing a holistic view of the market that you're working with, and anticipating trends, needs, and threats. That's especially true, I think, in consumer markets where you need a multi-dimensional perspective on what you're looking at. Really the key, though, I believe, with the diverse group and making it work is that you need to make sure that there's defined decision makers and decision influencers, and that everybody understands their part and also respects those of the others so that you can really take in that dissenting view and opinion and have a healthy buy-in and commitment.
Great, thank you. Others, thoughts?
Yeah, I'll go quickly. I mean, I was just going to say, just piggybacking on what Kristina was saying, I think in general, most of us would believe that in diversity, you're bringing strength to a decision, right? But I think also there's kind of the pros and cons of it, right? The pros being that the broader your scope of consideration, theoretically, the results are going to be better, right? The varying approaches make it harder to kind of support a consensus decision. So it really depends on how, as a group, you're looking to make a decision. That's all I would add.
And Aaron, I just have a minor point because I think Kristina and Kristina have nailed it. In my opinion, we need to be careful of focusing on what I'll call phenotypical diversity, that is sort of visible diversity, when what you're really looking for is diversity of perspective. And that oftentimes is associated with a woman and a man may have different perspectives on things, but they may have the exact same life experiences and the exact same perspective, and we're really not getting much diversity of opinion relative to have an engineering person and a marketing person both involved in that discussion. And so it's, make sure you're not getting a false diversity if what you're looking for is a diversity of ideas.
Such a great reminder. Thank you for that. When we did our research with the Financial Times, we as Kingsley Gate asked one question in our multi-question survey, which was, to what extent do you agree with the following statement? And this statement happened to be, quote, I frequently rely on intuition or gut feelings when making decisions. One of the things that was really interesting is the result here was high for our entire population. It was 60% agreement with that statement, like agreement or strong agreement with that statement across the board. But one of the things that was really unique was that when we cut this question result by some of the demographics we had captured in the beginning of the survey, we found that a C-level executive was much more likely to agree with this statement than a C-1 or C-2 respondent. And one of the things that just made us think about was that this role of intuition or gut feeling, perhaps after an exercise where inputs from across the organization have been collected, where, Gary, to your point, marketing and engineering have all been able to have their say, where all the data maybe has been looked at, perhaps there is a role for intuition and gut feeling that either needs to be accounted for in the process or is just something really worth considering. And so, Christine, the question that I would ask you is, A, maybe definitionally, what does this idea of intuition or gut feeling, what does it mean to you? B, what are your reactions to the fact that we observe this delta between C-suite and those who are still senior executives but less senior? And then C, what do you think the implications might be for companies that want to get better at decision making? How should they take this learning into account?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think it's a great question. I think for me, intuition or gut basically means your experience and belief system, right? And so your experience also can come on your reliance on data and metrics. I think people usually make a decision from their intuition easily when they have a high level of EQ, where I think your IQ is normally more data driven. And so I think when you have a balance of both, you can rely on your intuition and gut. And I think intuition and gut was maybe more taboo 50 years ago, right? Where it just feels a little bit airy-fairy and like a feeling, where really I think intuition and gut also is based on your experience. And so I think that goes into the second question, which is the delta, right? I think senior executives tend to just be more confident in their own intuition. But I think the confidence in that intuition comes from their experience. And I think the more data points you have, the more you can base your experience on whatever your answers would be or however you would make your decisions. I think the more junior you are, the more likely you are to rely on pure data to make a decision because you're not quite there in your level of confidence to go with your gut. And I think the last question is, I think it's really important to foster the development of EQ in that C-1 and C-2 grouping. And so whether it's OD or coaching for that level of management, I think no matter how senior you are, kind of having that executive coaching is always a good thing. But I think especially for that C-1 and C-2, it really helps them to just trust and have more confidence in their own decision-making skills. And I think the more senior your leadership team is, the more you want to provide data and metrics to them to really be able to balance out your natural reliance on intuition.
Aaron, I can add on that a little bit in terms of when you first said intuition and gut feelings and what you think of. And I kind of think of heuristics, which are really our mental shortcuts in order to make decisions and problem solve. They often have very little data, but they're correct most of the time. They're kind of our mental way of streamlining, I would say. There's several that we use in executive decision making. Representative, which is we go to what we recognize, or anchoring an adjustment, such as getting a ballpark and then, kind of adapting that until we get to something that we're comfortable with. The more experience an executive does have at making decisions or has been in an environment where decisions are well made, it really makes these heuristics more accurate. And that comes from experience. And that's probably where I think that difference between the 60 and the 76% comes in.
And Aaron, I'll offer a few thoughts on this. Some of us may have read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink. It came out a few years ago. I'm a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell's, but I thought the thing was nonsense. It had a whole set of examples of where somebody used intuition to override data without any of the counterfactuals of where people used intuition to override data and got it completely wrong. And so it was a set of interesting and exciting anecdotes, but without any statistical suggestion that if you always trust your intuition, you're always going to be right because you're a particular expert. And I think all of us have had the experience of being in a room with a very senior person who said, I hear all those facts, but my gut tells me boom, and it's just plain wrong, right? That it turns out facts are facts and oftentimes actually suggest what's right. And so I am a believer in listening to your gut, but I'm also a believer in questioning your gut. And if you start to work with people that only trust their gut and don't question it, I'd keep an eye on the stock price because I think that you can get into some very dangerous habits. The only other thing I'd add to that, and I know we'll probably talk about this more later, is there are a whole set of unconscious biases that influence the way we make decisions. Almost all of them are basically gut reaction related. They're actually where your gut takes you, but your gut is taking you unconsciously to the wrong place, or at least to a biased place. It may or may not be wrong, but it is biased a particular direction. And we can talk more about that later. So my one caveat on all of this is you definitely get better at intuition. The more experience you get, you start to trust your intuition, the more experience you get, but be careful of your intuition. It is not by definition right just because you're more experienced.
Yeah, I really appreciate the depth of all of your answers. And I think that in my mind, I almost would draw a distinction. There is that intuition, which is based on nothing, for lack of a better word, which is likely very susceptible to cognitive biases and will end up being the right answer in a few rare instances. I think about examples of breakthrough innovation like Steve Jobs in the iPhone or Henry Ford in the Model T. And in those cases, they had vision kind of beyond what the facts would have been able to tell them. But most of the time, as you're pointing out, Gary, it is at the very least biased and very often then wrong. Versus a type of intuition, which I think, Kristina, to your point, is honed over time. And I think there's something interesting about kind of knowledge or familiarity with a market, an industry, a customer segment. And that's almost like factual knowledge that becomes so ingrained, it feels like intuition, because it's not necessarily a new data set that one is looking at or a new analysis that one is taking into consideration, but rather the pattern recognition that's been garnered over time that says, I have an understanding of how dynamics in this industry work. And that's how I'm able to assess on gut feel that idea A is better than idea B. And I think that those two are distinct, but could easily both be categorized as what we're calling gut feeling or instinct.
Yeah, Aaron, I'll add another component too. When interviewing and talking with really strong executives about making quick decisions, it's interesting because the ones that I felt have been really strong have all brought up the fact that they have trusted their teams, have already fully vetted the data and the opinions before that decision has even gotten to them. And so I think when you see good decisions versus not, is that they do have that trust in their teams, versus those that don't have it are often using, as Gary mentioned, some of their individual bias to control their decision-making abilities.
And I would add one more thing to that. I love what Gary said about questioning your gut and your intuition, because I think so many times, especially in the roles that Kristina and I have, and Gary, I would say you too, when we're interviewing so many C-level candidates, after this many years of interviewing, at least I do this, I always say, oh, I know within 5 minutes if the person is right or not, right, for this job. And I have to stop myself sometimes and say, okay, I'm making this decision purely on my gut, right? My gut is telling me XYZ candidate is totally wrong for this job because in the first 5 minutes they've done this, right? But it's almost like I have to stop myself and say, I'm going to give myself some time, rely on the data and the questions that I'm actually asking, get to the end of it, and then make my decision. And so I think questioning your gut and intuition is a really important thing as you're making decisions as well.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we are about halfway through our time, so it would behoove us, I feel, to move to some of the questions that have been submitted by the audience. We have one that's come in from Jaime Espinoza. And this question is, based on your experience and research, when are most decisions being made? Continuously, or on specific forums such as steering committees or board meetings? Maybe, Gary, you want to start?
I'm happy to go first on this, Aaron. It really ends up being very company specific. And again, I'll paint bookends just to illustrate the point. There's some companies, particularly smaller ones, but not always, that are still very autocratically run. And so decisions are primarily taken by the CEO. That, decisions of import are primarily taken by the CEO. mostly data is teed up for that individual and then they decide. And so there's no steering committee. There's, the board meetings in those organizations are, let's say, highly orchestrated affairs. And decisions are ratified, but not actually made. And then there's other organizations that really do use a much more of a consensus-driven approach, and they use steering committees or just committees in general to make decisions. I'll pick one I know very well, which is my own. We're a partnership, and partnerships do not like being told what to do by any individual person. And so as a result, some of our most important decisions are made by committee. I have some clients that think that is just insanity, that no committee could ever make the right decision, and that all decisions should ultimately be made by one or two individuals. And so there's not really either a right answer or a preponderance answer, I think, on this one. It's just organizations design for the way they feel and want to run.
I think as we talked a little bit too, I'll add that having a framework, I mean, there's situations where different types of decisions need to be made in every size company, depending on the scenario and what's going on. I know Gary could probably speak more. They have a great article where they really kind of look at the big bet decisions versus the consensus decisions and when those are appropriate and how to make those strong. And so I think it's important to have a framework so that you can decide when those different types of decisions need to be made. And then you're able to move a little more quickly. In terms of when they're made and kind of the autocratic, I think the example we see most often is often with founders. When we work to help replace founders, we come in and we often see that they do still have that very command or autocratic type decision-making style.
Thank you. Let's move on to another audience question. So this one came in from Michael Short. The question is, do the panel have further examples of where prioritization and learning about it has brought significant gains in decision-making? And how did clients/companies bring this into acceptance? If I may, I want to just share one finding from Kingsley Gate's research that I think is relevant to the question before opening it up to the panel. One of the questions that we asked in our survey was, of all the senior executives who were responding, how many of them had had an explicit conversation about decision-making, anything about it, their experience, their capabilities, the scope of the role they were interviewing for? How many of them had that discussion at interview stage before accepting their current jobs? And the truth of the matter is, there was a huge percentage of our population, an entire quarter of our sample, who said they never had that discussion. And we found that really surprising. We actually, in some ways, liken that to accepting a job without ever talking about the team composition or your personal compensation, like things that we just think are kind of table stakes for understanding what a senior executive scope looks like. And so not only one, did we find that a quarter of the time this wasn't happening, but then we compared the level of job satisfaction among the subpopulation who had had the discussion versus those who hadn't. And we found that the satisfaction levels among those who had were 1.4x higher. Meaning that while having this injected into the interview is by no means a guarantee that all of the company's decision-making woes will be solved, it's at the very least a low effort, kind of low-hanging fruit way to make executives have a realistic preview of the job that they're about to step into, and maybe even start thinking about, okay, how are we going to approach decision-making before they step foot day one on the job? So that's just one finding, but now I want to hear from the panel other examples or other texture on this question.
Aaron, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. So maybe and we may ask Michael to explain it a little more, or maybe you understand it and can explain it a little more. But when we say further examples of where prioritization and learning about it has brought significant gains, in prioritization of what?
My sense is, I think the question is where a company has said, we don't feel that our decision-making effectiveness is where it needs to be. Let's focus on that and drive improvement.
I gotcha. Okay. I'm happy to offer a couple starting thoughts because I've actually worked on this with a few different clients at different points. The first thing you have to do is to figure out what the problem or problems are. So is the issue that you're getting to poor decisions and you can't figure out why the process is yielding poor decisions? Or is the issue that is a little where we started our conversation initially, that you have a decision-making process that feels like it's overly structured, takes too much time, may get to perfectly good decisions, but have wasted a lot of people's time along the way? Or, and I'm making up different issues, or is the issue that you don't feel like you've got consensus around decisions that need to have consensus again? So the first step in any of these things is a diagnostic process to figure out what problem are we solving. And then as part of that diagnostic process, a little bit of root cause. And I'll give an example of an investment firm that I worked closely with, where we went back and looked at where they had made, and generally speaking, they made great investment decisions. But you'd like to actually be perfect if you could, or at least not have some really bad ones. And they, so we went back and looked at the ones that were bad to figure out where they had gone wrong. I won't bore you with all the details, but one thing really jumped out, which is when the two founders, they had an investment committee that was actually all of the partners. When the two founders jumped into the discussion early to say what they thought, that was kind of the end of the discussion. And if they got it right, everything was fine. But if they got it wrong, it didn't matter what other, because no one else was going to take them on. And so we made one slight, we did some other stuff for them too, but we made one slight tweak, which is you don't get to speak until everybody else that wants to speak has spoken. And it at a minimum, it allowed a broader set of voices in the room and a broader set of facts to be brought up before ultimately they did end up making the decision, but they ensured that they had heard everything by not speaking too quickly. Very minor tweak led to a very major change in how decisions were made.
That's an interesting point, Gary. I think always in our process, in terms of when we're working with a hiring team, we always want the hiring manager to go last, to have the final decision maker give the last opinion, or else you won't hear that. And it's not conscious, it's just you're focused on, oh yeah, that is a great point. So I appreciate that.
Other examples or thoughts on Michael's question? Kristina?
I think the only other thing, yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think the only other thing I would add is, taking it back to the hiring process, right? Which is kind of what we live in, what Kristina and I live in every day. I think to a certain extent, there becomes this kind of decision-making fatigue. And so how do you get executive teams to just make the decision, however that comes about, but then being able to put some metrics and time around the making of the decision? Because I think when there are so many opinions, especially in hiring, right, of whether they should bring on an executive or not, it can take weeks to come up with an answer because everybody has an opinion on why this person works or doesn't work. You get to the end of the process and the candidate is done, right? Because now it's taken 3 weeks post final interview to make a decision. And so I think there is also putting data and metrics around the time of the decision making as well.
And as I think that Michael was asking, really having that prioritization established before the process even begins. In our case, with candidates, making sure you have the critical needs and the nice to haves and then the lower needs. Otherwise, we find that we spend a lot of time debating some of those low priorities and not really focusing on the critical ones. And in that case, you lose out on a lot of great talent and assets that you can bring to the company when you're nitpicking at some of those low priorities.
And I think one other thing I would add is just to be, from a hiring perspective, is to be transparent in your decision-making process, right? And so I think when candidates know, our decision-making process, consists of, I'm making up the number, these 7 things, and these are the people that you'll be meeting with. And then at the end, we're going to check references, and the references are just as important as the time that you've spent with our organization. And so we're looking at an XYZ period of time. At least the person knows what they're getting into, and they're not thinking for 2 weeks, they're interviewing other candidates, they're not interested in me. So I just think transparency around the process is helpful too.
Great. We have another question that's come in from an anonymous attendee, and it's related to this topic of hiring. So stay on that for a moment. The question here is, given what we shared about our research and how important it is to cover this idea of decision-making during the interview, something that may sound obvious to all of us, but clearly a quarter of the time isn't happening. How do you recommend hiring managers or HR professionals ask meaningful, hard-hitting interview questions about executive candidates' decision-making? Again, whether it be past-looking or future-looking. Maybe Kristina, you can start.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we as Kingsley Gate did this research, that was the most startling statistic for us, is that it was only covered 25% of the time. And it's such a key thing of all the leadership skills that we're evaluating. Really, in the end, the outcome and result is good decision making. So before kind of talking about specific questions, I think some of the key areas that we're looking at when we're evaluating decision making is looking at risk tolerance, inclusion and openness, critical thinking, ability to delegate those decisions and not have to make all those decisions themselves, and how they handle dissenting views and opinions and utilize that information. I also really encourage using real scenarios. If you know you have a decision coming up in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years, go ahead and create a question around that so you can really engage with the candidate in how that situation would play out. In terms of types of questions, we do have an article, Erin, we can share that after, that looks at some key questions we recommend in terms of decision making with C-levels. But some of those include, tell us about a significant business risk you took. How have you been inclusive and consider diverse perspectives in making decisions? How do you rely on data versus intuition, as we had discussed before, in your decision-making process? And then also, I think it's really important to ask about always ask about prior experiences to understand, maybe ask what 2 pieces of information they wish they had, so that you can really assess their critical thinking and awareness in their decision-making process.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts?
I don't know that I would have much more to add to it. I think Kristina kind of nailed that one, but I think it's maybe just having a couple questions, whatever it may be, to ask the candidate. So as simple as asking them, what is their general approach to decision making, and just kind of having them talk through that. How do they use data and metrics when they're making decisions? And then, going back to how often do you use your intuition and gut, and what does that mean to you? So I think it's simply having questions for the candidates around decision making that can help you kind of make a decision around how they view the whole process.
And I obviously don't do as much, I shouldn't say obviously, but I don't do as much interviewing as Kristina or Christine do, given our relative jobs. But I always find it interesting to ask people some version of, when you got it wrong, why did you get it wrong, and what did you learn from it, and how much of it was process versus gut versus something else. And you learn about character and how they answer that question also.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, all 3 of you mentioned gut, and I think one of the things that is common about your respective jobs is you're all client counselors. So I think it's a good opportunity to move to another anonymous attendee question, which is, thank you for your time. I appreciate the insights. For leaders that lean toward gut versus data, how would you go about influencing them or convincing them to slow down and look at data when urgency seems high? All of you as trusted advisors, a big part of the value add is pushing and friction and challenging and helping people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to go first. There is a philosophy, particularly in the Valley here, of move fast and break things. And without going into specifics, we've seen in the news, some examples of where that move fast and break things strategy probably hasn't worked as well as people would have liked. And so Yeah, the way I've had that conversation, particularly with somebody who is gut driven, and particularly when there's a strong sense of speed is critical, is trying to break the decisions into the ones where speed is actually more important than accuracy. It touches a little on the point I was making earlier, because there really are some things where anything within this spectrum is probably fine, because you can also adjust as you go. And so you're not trying to get to a rifle shot, you're getting to a shotgun shot and then adjust later. And so it is more around speed and everybody marching the same way and then adjust as you go. And then there's others where, you know, you're looking to make a major acquisition at a big dollar amount, and you'd sure like to get that one right, because there's no adjustments afterwards. You're basically solving a problem if it turns out you get either pricing wrong or the acquisition itself wrong. And so there's a little bit of just pick the decisions and then figure out which ones need to be more accurate and take a little more time, and which ones you can actually say, let's get it more or less right, and then constantly revisit.
Great. Thank you. I think, yeah, that's a level of intentionality that I'm not sure all companies go through. In fact, some of them probably, even if you asked what are the top decisions that you need to make in the next quarter, may not be able to list them. And certainly that next layer of let's separate out which ones are really, you know, like within a broad range, everything's acceptable versus it's specifically crucial to pinpoint correctly. I would say they're probably very few who would be able to have that answer ready offhand and have the whole leadership team kind of be in agreement about what those are. Kristina, other thoughts on how to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll add, and I think if my understanding is it's a question, correct me if I'm wrong, coming in how best to influence.
Mhm.
And that goes back to earlier mentioning, you know, there's decision makers and there's decision influencers. And so it's important that organizations understand what those are. It's important to understand the difference between inclusion and consensus, right? And for everybody's satisfaction, I think in the end, that needs to be clearly clarified, whether you're a decision maker, influencer. And it just goes back to the importance of really having an open, transparent listening culture to be able to speak those and have a safe environment for leaders to be able to speak their opinions.
Yeah, and I
Right.
think the only thing I would add there is that for the person that had asked the question is, you know, when you don't want a leader to purely rely on their instinct and their gut, it's to have the data ready for them, right? And so whatever information you can actually provide to them before they're making the decision is going to be the most helpful, right? Because asking them to go look at the data, it's probably not going to happen. But actually providing the data for them while they're trying to make the decision is going to it's kind of how you're gently influencing them to not make the decision purely on their intuition.
Great. Okay. I will, there's one more question, at least as of right now. And so this will be the last, and then maybe we'll have time for some closing statements. And this one I will direct toward you, Christine, at least at the start. Many companies are going through the motions of making decisions every day, but they don't necessarily take that step back to reflect. It's almost like metacognitive awareness. They don't take the step back to say, what are we doing and how? They make the decisions because that's what's required to run the business, but there's not a lot of self-reflection on how are we doing this? Are we doing it as well as we would like to, etc. And that also is true of hiring managers, either thinking about A, the decision of how do we get to a hire, and or B, also how do we bring in people who are going to have an influence over our decision-making processes, culture, etc. And so the question is, for those who aren't having this as top of mind, what would you advise them to think about or do differently going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, look, I don't know that people necessarily look at the decision-making process as a separate category of its own when they're thinking about the skill sets, right? And so I think it's thinking about some of the other questions to get there, the other questions that they ask, like, how are they setting up their team's culture? How do you develop your leadership team? How do they drive strategy? How do they provide feedback, right? So I think sometimes it's those questions that get you to the question of decision-making. And so I think it becomes an aspect of all of these skill sets. And so the focus is a little bit deeper on what is the actual process of making a decision rather than are you just making good decisions. So
Thank you. Other thoughts?
And the only thing I'd add is there's an interesting book some of my partners wrote about a year ago. I forget the exact name, but the gist of it is CEO Excellence. And they did a whole set of interviews with some of the world's best CEOs. They came up with a short list that they then went out and were able to, based on actual performance and a whole set of other metrics. And they came up with 6 different things that define CEO excellence. And I won't bore you with all 6 because you can find it online. But the first on their list was setting direction, and the last was managing personal effectiveness. And those are both they actually tie together, of course, right? And they both involve making good decisions, but also involve the process by which you make good decisions. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to interview, for both the process itself and, in a sense, how do you then at point make a decision, and what do you think of as a good versus a bad decision? Because it's not always outcome, right? The analogy sometimes I use is putting in golf, which is if you put the ball exactly where you intended to put it and it didn't do what it was supposed to do, you may have made a bad decision, but you executed it extremely well. And so you have to just sometimes figure out what the flaw is, or sometimes the world just turned in a way that you hadn't expected.
I think about that all the time when it comes to the risk management function sitting inside so many organizations, which is that the outcome is almost independent. I mean, people don't view it that way, right? But a catastrophic outcome can be the result of a very thorough, rigorous decision process that you would actually want to repeat. And if you repeated it 99 times, you would get a different outcome. It's just the stochastic nature of the universe that led in that one case to things going askew, even though, again, the process was quite defensible.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It's you have to be careful of learning just from outcomes that you didn't expect, be they positive or negative, because the other happens too, right? Somebody gets lucky with a bad decision that happens to play out in a way they hadn't expected it. They had hoped that it would, but there was nothing in the decision-making process that should have gotten them to a positive outcome. And they suddenly decide they're a genius coming out of that,
And
which
other people decide they're a genius too. That's a heuristic that we all rely on.
Yes, yes. In terms of kind of the question too, and having, just making decisions versus having a framework there. I mean, that's one of the key things we want to partner with the leadership team when we first come in, is really helping us and them to understand and have transparency and awareness about the current state decision-making environment, because you need to be able to set those expectations with that new hire that's coming in, so that they're aware to be successful, and really looking at the aspirations of the company and what those long-term goals are, so that this new member of this leadership team can help contribute to that. But in order to have that, you need to have the discussion and openness to have awareness of what your decision-making environment is.
Great. Thank you. Well, we've covered all the questions that have come in from the audience. Thank you to the audience for your engagement, your thoughtfulness. Any closing thoughts, anything we didn't cover from any of the panelists? After which then I'll say a few words and then we'll wrap up.
The only one we touched on that I'll offer 2 seconds more of thought is this notion of unconscious biases. They really do come into play, particularly in hiring decisions. It's one of the most noticeable spots, but really in any kind of decision making, be it small or large. And you know, if you get the opportunity as an individual on the Zoom to do some reading on the topic, I think you'll find it quite compelling. These are psychological biases that are part of the human condition. They were, you know, at some point they were hardwired into our systems. They helped us with a variety of different things. Some of what Kristina talked about, you know, the ability to categorize actually allowed you to make better decisions in a shorter period of time, but they can be wrong too, because you're categorizing by adding more information to something you've already decided a particular answer. So there's a whole set of these biases. The best decision-making processes I've seen acknowledge the biases that can cause you to go wrong, and build in little, for lack of a better word, kind of stop gaps at those things where they can say, let's test and make sure we're not making this mistake. Let's test and make sure we're not making this mistake. And I know at a very personal level, I've got a bias when I hire somebody for McKinsey. If we bring in somebody at the outside as a partner, I like people that have a certain profile. And there are lots of other great profiles at the firm, but I happen to like this one. And I have to be very careful of not applying that bias to somebody who'll be terrific, but doesn't fit that profile that I like.
Your comment made me think about when I was working at LinkedIn, one of the things we looked at, which is maybe even 1 degree more subtle than profile, is we said, we think we have a bias for a certain communication style. Interview. We really like people who communicate their ideas in this specific way. And we might be ignoring the content because we're so wrapped up in how good or how bad the communication is. And so that was a big learning and aha moment. And we built a different interview process once we realized that that was a potential trap we were falling into.
I agree with both. I think both, when we really think of, you know, mentioning earlier, we talked about diverse, we have individual differences that create diversity, but then as Gary just mentioned, those cognitive bias, particularly in decision-making and in hiring around prior knowledge, hindsight, what we see is inevitable, or eliminating information that we think is going to be risky. It's, you know, there's a lot of watch outs with that, including kind of decision paralysis, of course, not getting there, and groupthink, and then being able to coordinate decisions between the group.
Right. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of this session. Thank you so much to our 3 esteemed panelists. Your insights, perspectives, experiences shared with the group were immensely valuable. Thank you so much to all the attendees. We are so happy that you were here, and we will send a follow-up with a link to the article that Kristina referenced, as well as a few other resources for you, I think within the next 24 hours. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Happy to do
you. Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.